It was late October, and the air had that crisp, clean chill that almost makes you feel alive. I remember standing at the base of the Appalachian Trail with my best friend, Eric. We'd planned this hike for months, an escape from the monotony of our office jobs, a chance to disconnect from the world for a weekend. The trail stretched endlessly before us, blanketed in fiery orange and gold leaves, and the only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees. It was perfect. We'd been hiking for hours when we decided to set up camp near a small clearing. There was a stream nearby, and the ground was flat enough for our tents. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and red, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, a tingling at the base of my spine. I told myself it was just the eerie beauty of being out in the wild, away from civilization. That night, as we sat by the campfire, Eric started telling ghost stories. It felt like a rite of passage, being out there in the wilderness, swapping tales meant to scare each other. I laughed along, but the stories felt too close, too real. There was something about the darkness around us, the way the trees seemed to lean in, almost listening. When it was my turn, I passed. I didn't want to summon anything into that silence. After the fire died down, we crawled into our tents. I remember lying there, staring at the nylon ceiling, trying to push away the unease that had settled over me. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves. At first, I thought it was Eric, maybe stepping out to relieve himself. But then I remembered the weight of his breathing, steady and deep, just a few feet away in his tent. The footsteps circled our campsite, slow and deliberate. They stopped, started again, and stopped once more. I held my breath, straining to hear, hoping it was just a deer or some other harmless animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Animals don't walk with purpose. They don't pace. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light filtered through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked untouched, but the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. Eric emerged from his tent, rubbing his eyes. He hadn't heard anything, but he saw the look on my face and didn't press me. We packed up quickly and hit the trail again. The second day was harder. The trail became steeper, the air thinner. We didn't pass another soul, which was strange. This part of the trail was supposed to be popular, especially during the fall. By afternoon, the sky grew overcast and the wind picked up, carrying whispers that sounded like voices if you listened too long. Around dusk, we found an old abandoned cabin just off the trail. It looked like it had been there for decades, leaning to one side, its windows shattered, and its roof sagging. Eric suggested we check it out, maybe take shelter there for the night. I didn't want to. I begged him to keep going, but he insisted, said it was better than sleeping outside with the wind picking up. Reluctantly, I followed him inside. The interior was worse than I'd imagined. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, jagged gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws. There was no furniture, just a fireplace filled with ash and a smell that I can only describe as decay. Eric joked about it being haunted, but I couldn't even force a laugh. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled through the broken windows, and every creak of the cabin felt like a footstep. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of Eric's voice. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hear what?" He pointed toward the door. It was open, swinging gently on its hinges, though we'd closed it before lying down. Beyond it, in the darkness, I saw movement, shadows shifting, merging, breaking apart. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Eric grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the door. The beam caught something, a figure standing just outside, its face obscured by the glare. It didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there staring at us. I couldn't make out its features, but I'll never forget the way it felt, like it was looking straight into my soul. Eric shouted at it, told it to leave, but it didn't react. Slowly, it stepped forward into the light. Its face, or what was left of it, was twisted, its skin pale and rotting. Its eyes were sunken black pits, and its mouth hung open as if it were screaming, though no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Eric grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back of the cabin. We scrambled out through a broken window, cutting ourselves on the shards of glass, and ran into the forest. We didn't stop, didn't look back. The whole time I felt like something was right behind us, breathing down my neck. We finally stopped when we reached a small clearing, gasping for air. Eric shone his flashlight around, checking for any sign of the thing that had chased us. The forest was silent, but the silence felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. Then, from the darkness, we heard it again. The growl. It was closer this time, and it wasn't alone. There were others, their voices blending into a symphony of rage and despair. The flashlight flickered, then died, plunging us into darkness. Eric fumbled for the spare batteries, but his hands were shaking too badly. I don't know how we made it through that night. We kept moving, stumbling over roots and rocks until we finally reached a ranger station at dawn. The ranger took one look at us, bloody, pale, shaking, and called for help. When we told him about the cabin, his face went white. He said there hadn't been a cabin in that area for over 50 years. It had burned down in the late 1960s after a group of hikers went missing. They'd found their bodies weeks later, mutilated beyond recognition. I still don't know what we saw that night. And I don't think I ever will. Eric and I never talked about it again. We drifted apart after that trip, and I can't blame him. Some things are too heavy to share, too dark to relive. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind picks up and the house creaks, I hear that growl. And I wonder if it ever really let us go.
Story number 2.
It was late March when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip through the Ozarks. I needed the solitude, the kind of reset only the wilderness could provide. People warned me about hiking alone, but I'd done it before. I liked the silence, the clarity that came with being alone in nature. It made me feel small, insignificant in the best way possible. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The sun was still low, and mist clung to the trees like a ghostly veil. There wasn't another car in sight, and that should have been my first warning. I brushed it off. Midweek in early spring wasn't peak season. No big deal, right? The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest with shafts of sunlight piercing the canopy. Birds sang, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the rhythm of my boots on the path was oddly comforting. By midday, I'd reached a small ridge overlooking a valley. I sat down to eat, taking in the view. That's when I noticed it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods far below. At first, I thought it was another hiker. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but something about the way they stood, completely still like a statue, made my skin crawl. I waved, hoping for a response, but they didn't move. I laughed nervously, telling myself I was being paranoid. Still, I packed up quickly and continued down the trail, casting glances over my shoulder. The figure was gone. By late afternoon, the trail had grown steeper, the trees thicker. The air felt heavier, the kind of oppressive stillness that comes before a storm. I checked the weather forecast that morning. Clear skies. So why did it feel like the forest was holding its breath? That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. They were faint, coming from somewhere behind me, just beyond the bend in the trail. I stopped, holding my breath. The sound stopped too. Slowly, I turned around. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I called out, my voice sounding far too small in the vastness of the forest. Hello? Anyone there? Silence. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer. But deep down, I knew better. I picked up my pace, my heartbeat matching the rhythm of my boots. The trail narrowed, snaking along the edge of a rocky cliff. I could see the valley far below, a sheer drop that made my stomach twist. That's when I saw it again. The figure. This time, it was closer, standing in the middle of the trail ahead. My breath hitched. It was wearing some kind of tattered cloak or robe, the fabric hanging in tatters. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I froze, unsure of what to do. "Hey," I called, my voice trembling. "Do you need help?" No response. It just stood there, unmoving. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the trail. I couldn't just stand there all night. Swallowing my fear, I stepped forward. The figure didn't move. I kept walking, forcing myself to breathe, to act normal. But as I got closer, it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, like smoke dissolving into the air. I bolted. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, my legs were shaking and my lungs burned. The sun was nearly gone, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was lost. The trail markers were nowhere in sight, and the trees all looked the same. I pulled out my map, but the fading light made it impossible to read. My phone? No service. Of course, panic clawed at my throat, but I forced it down. I needed to find shelter before nightfall. Wandering off trail wasn't ideal, but staying in one place felt worse. I spotted a narrow game trail cutting through the underbrush and decided to follow it. That's when I heard the laughter. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. A low, raspy chuckle that sent chills racing down my spine. I whipped around, scanning the trees. Nothing. But the laughter came again, closer this time. I broke into a run, branches clawing at my face and arms. The laughter followed, echoing through the forest. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, overlapping, a chorus of mockery that made my skin crawl. I stumbled into a clearing, my chest heaving. At the center was a dilapidated cabin, its roof caved in and its windows dark. I didn't want to go inside, but the laughter was closing in, surrounding me. I had no choice. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The interior was worse than I imagined. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and rot. Broken furniture was strewn across the floor, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the wood. The laughter stopped. I stood there, frozen, the silence pressing down on me. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. "Why did you come here?" I spun around, but there was no one. My chest tightened, and I backed away, my foot catching on something. I looked down and saw a pile of bones, bleached white and scattered haphazardly. Human bones. Before I could process what I was seeing, the door slammed shut. The room plunged into darkness, and the air grew cold. My breath puffed out in white clouds, and I felt it. A presence, heavy and malevolent, pressing against me from all sides. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling me. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When I finally managed to switch it on, the beam caught something in the corner. A face. Pale, gaunt, its eyes hollow and black. It grinned, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged, yellowed teeth. I screamed and bolted for the door, yanking it open with all my strength. I didn't stop running. Didn't care about the branches slicing into my skin or the roots trying to trip me. The forest seemed alive, closing in around me, the laughter echoing in my ears. Somehow, I made it back to the trailhead. My car was still there, still a beacon of salvation. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I haven't gone hiking since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. The laughter, soft, raspy, just outside my window, and I know it's waiting for me to come back.
Story number 3.
The morning was crisp as I parked my car at the edge of a little-used trail in the Smoky Mountains. It was the kind of chilly air that made every breath feel sharper, more vivid. I wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. The trail was officially closed due to maintenance, but I'd heard from a friend that it led to an abandoned fire tower with breathtaking views. Curiosity outweighed caution, as it often does. The path was narrow and overgrown, a tunnel of skeletal trees whose branches formed an archway overhead. As I walked, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt. It felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. About an hour in, I came across a sign hammered to a tree. The paint was faded, but the words were clear. "Turn back. Not safe." I stared at it, my heart sinking. Something about the haphazard way the sign was nailed up felt urgent, desperate. But the stubborn part of me refused to be scared off. It was probably just an old warning left behind by rangers. I pressed on. The trail wound higher, the trees thinning to reveal glimpses of the valley below. It should have been beautiful, but the unease gnawing at me dulled the wonder. That's when I saw it, a shape ahead on the trail, partially hidden behind a tree. My first thought was that it was another hiker, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. The shape shifted slightly, stepping out from behind the tree. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in old, tattered clothes that didn't look right for hiking. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "Lost?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I forced a polite smile. "No, just heading to the fire tower." He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head as if considering something. Then he pointed down the trail with one bony finger. "Not much further," he said, his lips barely moving. "Thanks," I muttered, hurrying past him. Every instinct screamed at me to keep walking, not to look back. But when I finally glanced over my shoulder, he was gone. The fire tower came into view about 30 minutes later. It rose from the forest like a skeleton, its metal frame rusted and weathered. The stairs spiraled upward, disappearing into the mist that clung to the mountaintop. I hesitated at the base, suddenly unsure if I wanted to climb it. The encounter with the man had shaken me more than I cared to admit, but I hadn't come all this way to turn back. I started up the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The higher I climbed, the stronger the wind became, howling through the metal beams. By the time I reached the top, I was gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles ached. The view was stunning, just as my friend had promised. Rolling hills stretched out endlessly, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. For a moment, I forgot my fear. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned, my stomach dropping. The man was standing at the edge of the clearing below, staring up at me. His face was clearer now, pale and waxy, his eyes sunken and empty. I couldn't look away. He raised one hand slowly and pointed at me. Suddenly, the wind died. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from below, but from the fire tower itself. "Leave," it hissed, the voice seeming to wrap around me. I spun around, but there was no one. The platform was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time, insistent. "Leave now." Panic surged through me. I practically flew down the stairs, my feet slipping on the rusted metal. When I reached the bottom, the man was gone. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. The trail back felt different. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches clawing at me as I passed. The air was thick, heavy, like I was wading through water. And then I realized I couldn't hear my own footsteps anymore. The forest had gone silent again, but this time it felt worse. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, suffocating, and then the laughter started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it grew louder, more distinct, high-pitched, unnatural, like children's laughter distorted through a broken radio. I broke into a run, my legs screaming in protest. The laughter followed, echoing through the trees, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I didn't stop until I saw the parking lot, my car sitting there like a lifeline. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them. As I bent to pick them up, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A face, pale and grinning, watching me from the edge of the woods. I didn't look back. I slammed the car into gear and sped down the dirt road, the trees blurring past me. When I finally reached the highway, the laughter stopped, replaced by the hum of the engine and my ragged breathing. I've told myself 1,000 times that it wasn't real, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but sometimes late at night I hear it again. The laughter, faint and distant, like it's waiting for me to return.
Story number 4.
The sun was already dipping behind the Appalachian foothills as I pulled into the parking lot of the Ridgeback Trail. I was running later than planned, but this hike had been on my bucket list for years. The trail was known for its sweeping views of the valley and a little-known historical site, the ruins of a 19th century logging camp deep in the forest. The trailhead was empty, the wooden sign faded, but still legible. Ridgeback Trail, 6 miles round trip. I hesitated. The idea of walking alone in the woods at dusk was unsettling, but I had a flashlight and enough daylight to make it to the ruins and back, or so I thought. The first mile was uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the ground littered with fallen leaves that crunched softly underfoot. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine. As the trees thinned, I caught glimpses of the valley below, the golden light of the setting sun stretching across the landscape. It was around the second mile that things began to feel wrong. The forest, so alive with the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls, had grown eerily quiet. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, as if the silence was amplifying them. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the fading light was playing tricks on my mind. Then I smelled it, a faint, acrid scent like burnt wood. It didn't belong here, in the middle of the forest. I stopped, scanning the trees for any sign of fire, but there was nothing. The smell lingered, faint but persistent, as I continued walking. When I reached the ruins, the sun was almost gone, the sky a wash of deep purples and blues. The remains of the logging camp were scattered across a clearing. Moss-covered stone foundations, rusted tools half buried in the dirt, and the skeletal frame of what might have been a cabin. I took out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing darkness, and began to explore. Something about the place felt heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. I chalked it up to the history of the site, imagining the lives of the loggers who had once lived here. But then I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound coming from the edge of the clearing. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like metal striking stone. I swung the flashlight toward the noise, but the beam only illuminated trees and shadows. I stood there, frozen, every instinct telling me to turn back. But curiosity won out. Slowly, I moved toward the sound, the beam of my flashlight bouncing with each step. The tapping stopped as I reached the far end of the clearing. I scanned the ground, half expecting to find some old machinery still working by some bizarre chance. But there was nothing, just silence and the faint smell of burning wood. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the soft dirt, a trail of barefoot prints leading deeper into the woods. They weren't mine. I'd been wearing hiking boots, and these prints were far too small, like those of a child. My chest tightened and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Logic told me to leave, but something compelled me to follow the trail. As I stepped into the forest, the air grew colder, the trees looming larger, their branches clawing at the sky. The footprints led to a small clearing right where the remnants of another cabin stood. Its walls were charred black, as if it had been consumed by fire long ago. The roof was gone, leaving only a jagged outline of beams against the darkening sky. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I stepped inside, the smell of ash overwhelming now. The floor was uneven, littered with debris and charred wood. In the center of the room, something caught my eye. A small, rusted axe lying on the ground. As I approached, the air grew heavy, each breath a struggle. The axe looked out of place, its blade clean despite the rust, as if it had been recently used. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed the handle, a sound tore through the silence. A child's scream. Piercing, gut-wrenching, and close. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The scream echoed through the forest, fading into a low, guttural growl. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but I was alone. Or so I thought. The shadows in the corner of the cabin seemed to shift, coalescing into a shape. It was faint at first, barely more than an outline, but it solidified as I watched, paralyzed. It was a figure, a child, no older than 10, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their face obscured by shadows. "Help me," the child whispered, their voice trembling. Before I could respond, the figure darted toward the doorway and disappeared into the woods. Against every ounce of common sense, I followed. The flashlight barely penetrated the darkness now, the trees closing in around me. The trail of footprints reappeared, leading me deeper into the forest. "Wait!" I called out, my voice cracking. The forest seemed to close in, the branches tangling together above me, blocking out the last traces of light. And then I saw it, the source of the footprints. The child was standing at the base of an ancient tree, its gnarled roots twisting like veins into the earth. They turned to face me, their features finally visible in the dim light. Their eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared into nothingness. Their mouth opened impossibly wide as they let out another scream, this one inhuman, a sound that rattled my bones. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, its beam spinning wildly before settling on the tree. And that's when I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, twisted in agony, emerging from the bark. Their mouths moved silently, as if they were screaming, but no sound came out. The child stepped closer, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. "Leave," they hissed, their voice layered with others, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to come from the forest itself. I scrambled to my feet and ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms, the forest a blur of shadows and fear. The laughter started then, high-pitched and mocking, chasing me down the trail. It grew louder, closer, until it was all I could hear. When I finally burst into the parking lot, the sound stopped. The forest was silent again, the air still. My car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. I didn't look back as I climbed inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I've told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I can still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet. And I know deep down that I'll never set foot in those woods again.
Story number 5.
It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I decided to hike the Ironwood Trail. The trail was tucked away in a remote part of the state forest, known only to a handful of locals. It wasn't officially marked, but it promised solitude and stunning views, which I desperately needed after a week of stress. I arrived at the trailhead late in the day, parking my car on a patch of flattened grass that passed for a parking lot. The air was sharp with the smell of fallen leaves, and the wind whispered softly through the trees. It was peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. The trail started wide and inviting, winding gently through a dense forest of oaks and pines. As I walked, the canopy grew thicker, filtering the sunlight into a golden haze. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The hum of the distant road faded until all I could hear was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. The trees around me were marked with strange carvings. Small, circular symbols cut deep into the bark, some no larger than my palm. They weren't initials or hearts like you'd expect from other hikers. These were intricate and almost ritualistic, the kind of markings you'd see in old, faded textbooks about folklore. I paused, running my fingers over one of the carvings. It felt wrong, like the wood was colder where the symbol had been etched. Shaking off the unease, I continued, telling myself it was probably just someone's idea of art. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trail narrowed as I climbed a gentle slope, the trees closing in around me. The golden light was gone now, replaced by a dim grayness as clouds rolled in overhead. My steps faltered when I spotted something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the trail. It was a man, or at least I thought it was at first. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned hunting gear, a dark coat and boots that came up to his knees. He stood perfectly still, his back to me, facing deeper into the forest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unnaturally loud in the silence. He didn't move. I hesitated, unsure whether to approach or turn back. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood, too rigid, like a mannequin placed there by some unseen hand. "Excuse me?" I tried again, taking a cautious step forward. Still no response. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. Something compelled me to keep walking, as if my feet were moving on their own. When I was about 20 feet away, he finally moved, his head tilting to the side, almost in slow motion. I froze. His head kept tilting, further and further, until it was nearly perpendicular to his body. Then he turned to face me. His face was wrong. It was pale, almost white, with features that seemed stretched, like skin pulled too tight over bone. His eyes were hollow black pits, and his mouth was stuck in an open, toothless grin that seemed to widen the longer I looked. I stumbled back, heart hammering, as the figure took a step toward me. His movements were jerky, like a marionette on tangled strings. I turned and ran, bolting back the way I'd come. The forest felt different now. The trail that had seemed so clear earlier was suddenly unfamiliar. Trees pressed in from all sides, their trunks marked with more of those strange carvings. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. I tried to calm myself, to focus on finding my way out, but the sound started then, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't a natural sound, not like the wind or an animal. It vibrated through the air, growing louder with each step I took. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare stop. I tripped over a root and went sprawling, my flashlight flying out of my hand. The hum grew deafening, and I felt the ground vibrate beneath me. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed the flashlight and swung it wildly around. That's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing between the trees. They were faint, like shadows that had stepped off the ground and taken form. Some were tall, others hunched and crooked, but all of them had the same hollow eyes and twisted grins. They didn't move, just stared, their empty faces turned toward me. I backed away, my flashlight flickering. The shadows didn't follow, but the hum persisted, a constant pressure in my ears. I turned and ran again, barely able to see the trail through the tears streaming down my face. When I finally broke through the tree line and into the clearing where I'd parked, the sound stopped. The figures were gone. The forest was silent. The air still. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, a beacon of normalcy in the nightmare I'd just escaped. I didn't stop running until I was inside, the doors locked and the engine roaring to life. As I peeled out of the clearing, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trailhead was empty, but the faint hum was back, just barely audible over the sound of the engine. I've tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the carvings were just graffiti and the figures were tricks of the light. But every time I close my eyes, I see them, the hollow faces, the twisted grins, and I hear that hum growing louder and louder until it drowns out everything else.
Story number 6.
It was a warm summer afternoon when my brother, Liam, and I decided to hike the Ravens Hollow Trail. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the trail was infamous among locals for its eerie reputation. The stories ranged from tales of strange noises to hikers disappearing without a trace. But Liam and I had always been skeptics, chalking up the legends to small-town folklore. We thought it'd be fun to prove the stories wrong. The trailhead was unmarked, accessible only through a gravel road overgrown with weeds. We parked our car and packed our gear, just the essentials for a few hours of hiking. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through dense woods. The canopy above was so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving the forest in a perpetual twilight. As we walked, we noticed strange carvings on the trees, spirals, crosses, and symbols we didn't recognize. Probably teenagers messing around, Liam said, running his fingers over one of the carvings. But his voice lacked its usual confidence. We pressed on, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each step. The forest was unnaturally quiet now, as if the wildlife had vanished. Even the air felt still, thick like we were moving through water. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something lurking in the shadows. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Liam replied, though his eyes darted around the trees. "Like we're being watched." Liam hesitated before answering. "Yeah, let's keep moving." The deeper we went, the more unsettling things became. The trail, once clear and easy to follow, seemed to shift beneath our feet. Rocks and roots appeared where there had been none before, and the path twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Then came the sound, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping in a chaotic murmur. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. "Do you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Liam nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, let's turn back." We retraced our steps, or at least we tried. The trail was unrecognizable, splitting into multiple paths that hadn't been there before. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. The whispers grew louder, circling us like an unseen predator. "Stay close," Liam said, his voice trembling. We stumbled through the forest, no longer following a trail, but hoping to find a clearing or some sign of civilization. The carvings on the trees became more frequent and more disturbing. They depicted crude, jagged figures, humanoid shapes with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness. We used our flashlights, their beams cutting through the shadows, but it felt like the light barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. The whispers were deafening now, and I was certain I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Shapes darting between the trees, always just out of view. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Liam nodded, gripping my arm. "Don't stop. Just keep walking." We came upon a clearing, but instead of relief, dread washed over me. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden structure, a crude totem made of branches and vines. It was adorned with animal skulls, feathers, and more of the strange symbols carved into the bark of the surrounding trees. "What the hell is this?" Liam muttered. Before I could answer, the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete it made my ears ring. Then, from the shadows beyond the clearing, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a gaunt frame that seemed barely human. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were black voids that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't walk, but glided toward us, its movements unnaturally smooth. Liam grabbed my hand and we ran. Branches whipped at our faces and the ground seemed to pull at our feet, but we didn't stop. The thing followed, its hollow eyes fixed on us, its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. We burst through the trees and onto a narrow dirt road. Our car was in sight, but so was the figure. It stood at the edge of the forest, watching us. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the air was so cold I could see my breath. We scrambled into the car and Liam started the engine. As we sped away, I looked back. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, hours later. We didn't tell anyone what happened, who would believe us? But I can still hear the whispers sometimes late at night, and I know Liam does too. The Ravens Hollow Trail is still there, still unmarked, and I wonder how many others have walked it, never to return.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a simple getaway. My friends and I, 4 of us in total, had planned a weekend hiking trip to Devil's Ridge. The name alone should have been enough of a warning, but we thought it was just another exaggerated local legend. The area was notorious for strange disappearances, but to us, it was just an untouched stretch of wilderness begging to be explored. We parked at the base of the ridge just as the sun began to rise, the forest alive with birdsong and the scent of pine. The plan was to hike to a remote campsite about 5 miles in, spend the night, and return the next day. We had all the essentials: food, water, and plenty of gear. None of us were inexperienced hikers, so we felt prepared. The first few hours of the hike were beautiful, the trail winding through thick woods and steep inclines. But as we climbed higher, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches reaching like claws. The air felt heavy, as if the mountain itself was pressing down on us. Even the birds had gone silent. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was low in the sky. The spot was a small clearing surrounded by trees so dense they felt like walls. The ground was littered with strange marks, scratches in the dirt that crisscrossed in no discernible pattern. Probably just animals, Alex said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. We set up camp quickly, the silence around us more oppressive than ever. Dinner was quiet, each of us too unsettled to make the usual jokes or banter. As darkness fell, we lit a fire, the small circle of light doing little to banish the shadows that seemed to creep closer with every flicker of the flames. It was Ryan who noticed the first oddity. "Do you hear that?" he asked, tilting his head. We all stopped and listened. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then it came, a faint humming, so low it was almost inaudible. It was rhythmic, like a distant chant carried on the wind. "Probably the wind," Sarah said, though her face was pale. "No wind," Alex muttered, pointing to the motionless trees. The humming grew louder as the night wore on, interspersed with faint rustling sounds that seemed to circle our camp. We shone our flashlights into the woods but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. "Let's just go to bed," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. We all agreed, retreating to our tents. I lay awake for hours, listening to the unsettling symphony outside. The rustling grew closer, and I could swear I heard whispers, soft, unintelligible words that sent chills down my spine. My heart raced as I clutched the knife I kept in my sleeping bag. Around midnight, the screams began. They were distant at first, faint cries that could have been animals. But as they grew louder, they became unmistakably human. High-pitched, desperate wails echoed through the forest, coming from every direction. "Get up!" Alex shouted, unzipping his tent. We all scrambled out, the fire barely illuminating our terrified faces. "What's happening?" Sarah cried, clutching Ryan's arm. "I don't know," Alex said, scanning the woods with his flashlight. "But we're not staying here." We began packing up in a frenzy, the screams continuing all around us. Then they stopped, as suddenly as they'd started. The silence was deafening, the forest holding its breath. And then we saw it. A figure stood just beyond the firelight, its silhouette barely visible. At first, I thought it was a person, but as it stepped closer, I realized how wrong I was. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight. "What the hell is that?" Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered. We were frozen, staring at the thing as it inched closer. Then it opened its mouth, and the screams returned, louder, closer, coming from the creature itself. "Run!" Alex yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand. We bolted into the woods, the firelight vanishing behind us. The forest was a labyrinth of trees and roots, and we stumbled blindly, the creature's screams echoing behind us. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, its inhuman wails growing louder. "Don't stop!" Alex shouted, but his voice was cut off by a strangled cry. I turned just in time to see him dragged into the darkness, the thing's elongated arms wrapping around him. His scream was cut short, replaced by a sickening crunch. "Keep running!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah and Ryan. We didn't stop until we burst into another clearing. The moonlight illuminated a small wooden cabin, like its windows dark and uninviting. But it was our only option. We ran to the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind us. The cabin was cold and empty, the air thick with the scent of decay. Dust covered every surface, and strange symbols were etched into the walls, similar to the marks we'd seen at the campsite. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Doesn't matter, Ryan said, bolting the door. We're safer in here. But the safety was an illusion. The screams returned, closer than ever, and then came the pounding. It started softly, a faint tapping at the walls, but quickly escalated to violent thuds that shook the cabin. The creature was outside, circling us, testing the barriers. Do you think it can get in? Sarah asked, clutching a makeshift weapon, a broken chair leg. I didn't answer. I didn't know. The pounding continued for hours, the creature relentless. Then, as dawn began to break, it stopped. The silence was almost worse, the anticipation of its return unbearable. We waited until the sun was fully up before venturing outside. The forest was eerily still, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by an unsettling calm. There was no sign of Alex or the creature. We made our way back to the car in silence, our nerves frayed and our bodies exhausted. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the creature watching us. But there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows. We never spoke about what happened, not to each other and certainly not to anyone else. But I still hear the screams sometimes, late at night, and I know I'll never set foot on Devil's Ridge again.
Story number 8.
The old path through Black Hollow Forest was a shortcut I never should have taken. People in town told stories about the Hollow, stories I always dismissed as superstition. It was the only way to make it to my sister's cabin before dark, though, and as someone who considered himself practical, I didn't put much stock in ghost stories. The forest felt different as soon as I stepped onto the trail. The air was heavier, cooler, and the canopy of trees blocked out most of the sunlight, plunging the path into an unsettling gloom. The birds that had filled the morning with their cheerful songs were silent here. Only the occasional rustle of leaves accompanied my footsteps. The unease began as a whisper in the back of my mind, but quickly grew louder with every step. The trail twisted and turned in unnatural ways, like it was deliberately trying to disorient me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Several times I stopped and looked over my shoulder, but the forest was empty, or at least it looked that way. An hour in, I noticed something strange. The trees bore marks, long, jagged scratches, too deep and uniform to be caused by animals. They lined the path every few feet as if marking territory. The air grew colder and a faint smell of decay wafted through the trees. It was then I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, dead quiet. I quickened my pace, the urge to get out of the woods overpowering my determination to stay calm. That's when I saw it for the first time. A figure, just ahead on the trail. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but as I drew closer, I saw that it wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its limbs moved in a way that defied anatomy. Its face, or lack thereof, was what froze me in my tracks. Where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. It didn't move at first, just swayed slightly, like a branch in the wind. Then, without warning, it tilted its head in my direction and took a step toward me. I ran. The path beneath my feet felt like quicksand, dragging me down with every step. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. Heavy, uneven footsteps, growing louder with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed myself harder than I ever had, the cold air burning my lungs. The trail forked ahead, and in my panic, I took the left path, hoping it would lead me out of the hollow faster. But the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer, their twisted branches forming a near impenetrable barrier. The footsteps behind me stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Then it spoke. The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and layered, as though several people were speaking at once. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. The voice came from all around me, as if the forest itself was alive. Slowly, I turned my head, and there it was, standing less than 20 feet away. Its featureless face seemed to study me, though it had no eyes. "You've seen too much," it said, the words dripping with malice. Before I could react, it lunged. Its movements were impossibly fast, its long arms reaching for me. I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and bolted off the trail, crashing through the underbrush. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. My legs burned, my vision blurred, but I kept running. The sound of its pursuit was relentless, snapping branches, guttural growls, and that horrible voice taunting me. There's no escape. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I broke through the trees and stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood an old, crumbling stone well, overgrown with moss. The air was colder here, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. I had no idea where I was, but I could feel the thing closing in. Desperate, I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a large branch lying nearby, and I grabbed it, brandishing it like a spear. The growls grew louder as the creature emerged from the tree line, its grotesque form illuminated by the fading light. I swung the branch as it lunged at me, the wood connecting with a sickening crack. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech, momentarily stunned. Seizing the opportunity, I sprinted to the well and peered inside. It was deep, the bottom swallowed by darkness, but I noticed something glinting in the faint light, a metal ladder bolted to the side. Without thinking, I climbed in. The smell inside the well was unbearable, the air thick and suffocating. I descended quickly, the creature's shrieks echoing above me. Just as I reached the bottom, I heard it clawing at the edge of the well. The darkness was absolute, but I could feel the ground beneath my feet. My hands found a narrow tunnel leading away from the well, and I crawled inside, the space so tight I could barely move. The creature's growls echoed down the shaft, growing louder as it followed me. I crawled for what felt like hours, the tunnel twisting and narrowing until I was certain I'd become trapped. Then, finally, I saw a faint light ahead. With a final burst of energy, I scrambled toward it, emerging into a small cavern. The cavern was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. At its center stood a massive tree, its roots snaking through the earth like veins. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Before I could take another step, the creature appeared at the tunnel's entrance, its twisted form silhouetted against the light. It didn't attack this time. Instead, it stood there, as if waiting. "You shouldn't have come," it said again, its voice reverberating through the cavern. The ground beneath me began to tremble, and the symbols on the walls glowed brighter. The tree's roots moved, shifting and writhing as if alive. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The last thing I remember is the creature stepping aside, and something far larger, far more horrifying emerging from the tunnel behind it. A pair of glowing eyes locked onto me, and the world went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the highway, miles from Black Hollow. My clothes were torn, my body bruised, but I was alive. I don't know how I escaped or why it let me go. I never told anyone what happened, but I've never been the same. I still hear its voice sometimes whispering in the dead of night. "You'll be back."
Story number 9.
I didn't want to go hiking that day. My friends, Kelly and Matt, had practically dragged me out of bed, saying I needed some fresh air and adventure. I had no real excuse to say no, so I reluctantly agreed, throwing on some hiking boots and grabbing my gear. They promised the trail was easy, a quick loop through a nearby forest with a great view of the valley. The trailhead was quiet when we arrived. Too quiet. There were no cars in the small parking lot, no other hikers in sight. "Guess we've got the place to ourselves," Matt said, grinning as he adjusted his backpack. I forced a smile and followed them into the woods. At first, the hike was pleasant enough. The trail was well maintained, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Kelly and Matt chatted animatedly about work and plans for the weekend, but I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling that settled in my chest the moment we stepped into the forest. About an hour in, things started to feel off. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that sank into your bones. The birds and insects that had been chirping and buzzing were suddenly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The forest felt different, heavier, like it was watching us. "Do you feel that?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Feel what?" Kelly replied, glancing back at me. "I don't know, like we're not alone." Matt laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies. It's just a forest." But it wasn't just a forest. I knew that deep in my gut. We reached a fork in the trail, and Matt insisted on taking the left path, even though the map clearly showed the right path led back to the parking lot. "It's a shortcut," he said confidently. "Trust me." I didn't trust him, but I followed anyway. The left path was narrower, overgrown, as if no one had walked it in years. The trees loomed closer, their twisted branches creating shadows that seemed to move even when the wind didn't blow. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. That's when we found the cabin. It was small and dilapidated, barely visible through the thick undergrowth. The wood was weathered and gray, the windows boarded up. "No way this is on the map," Kelly said, pulling out her phone. But there was no signal. "We should keep going," I said, my voice shaking. The place radiated unease, like it didn't want us there. But Matt, always the thrill seeker, wanted to check it out. "Come on," he said, already making his way to the door. "What's the worst that could happen?" Kelly hesitated, but curiosity won out, and she followed him. I stayed on the trail, my heart pounding as I watched them disappear inside. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The forest seemed to grow darker, even though the sun was still high in the sky. I called out their names, but there was no response. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped off the trail and approached the cabin. The door creaked open as I pushed it, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The walls were lined with strange symbols carved into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize but knew instinctively weren't good. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and in the center of the room was a trapdoor, slightly ajar. I called out again, my voice trembling. "Matt? Kelly?" Something shifted below, a faint rustling sound. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't leave them. Taking a deep breath, I approached the trapdoor and peered inside. The darkness was impenetrable, but I could hear movement. "Guys?" I whispered. A hand shot up from the darkness, pale and thin, gripping the edge of the trapdoor. I stumbled back, heart racing. Then another hand appeared, and slowly, something began to crawl out. It wasn't Matt or Kelly. The thing that emerged was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin too pale, stretched tightly over its bones. Its head tilted unnaturally as it looked at me with empty, black eyes. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the cuts and scrapes from the branches tearing at my skin. The thing moved fast, too fast. I could hear it behind me, its heavy breaths and the snapping of twigs as it gave chase. I burst back onto the trail, but it didn't feel like the same trail. The trees were different, older, their gnarled branches reaching down like claws. The air was suffocatingly cold, and the path seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. And then I heard it, Matt's voice, faint and distant, calling my name. "Over here," he shouted. "Help me!" I stopped, torn between the need to run and the need to find my friends. The voice came again, closer this time, but something about it was wrong. It was flat, emotionless, like someone imitating his voice rather than actually being him. I called out, "Where's Kelly?" There was no response. The forest around me seemed to shift, the trees twisting and warping as if they were alive. The voice came again, now right behind me. "Help me." I turned, but no one was there. Instead, I saw the cabin, impossibly close, as if I'd never left. The door was wide open, and standing in the doorway was Kelly, or something that looked like her. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Come inside," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "We've been waiting for you." Behind her, shadows moved, tall, thin figures with glowing eyes. I stumbled back, my mind racing, and turned to run again. But the path was gone. The forest had swallowed it, leaving me surrounded by trees and darkness. The last thing I remember is tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. The world spun, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the parking lot by my car. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty lot. My clothes were torn, my body covered in scratches and bruises, but there was no sign of Kelly or Matt. I reported them missing, but the search teams never found a trace. The trail, they said, didn't lead to any cabin. In fact, the left path didn't exist at all. I don't know what happened in that forest, but I can still hear their voices sometimes calling to me in the dead of night. Come back.
Story number 10.
It started as an ordinary hiking trip, a weekend escape from the chaos of the city. My friends, Jason, Emma, and I had planned this for weeks. A trek through the Appalachian wilderness seemed like the perfect antidote to our stress-filled lives. We packed light, geared up, and drove to a remote trailhead we'd found online. It was supposed to be an off-the-beaten-path experience. No crowds, no noise, just us and nature. Looking back now, I wish we had chosen anywhere else. The hike began with excitement. The sun filtered through the trees, the air smelled fresh and earthy, and the distant sound of birdsong filled the air. We followed a narrow dirt trail that wove through the forest. Jason joked about how he'd seen too many horror movies to feel completely comfortable being so far off the grid, but we all laughed it off. After all, this was supposed to be an adventure. About 5 miles in, we came across a clearing with an old, crumbling cabin in the center. Its roof sagged, the wooden boards were weathered, and the windows were either broken or missing entirely. A strange sense of unease washed over me as we approached, but curiosity got the better of us. We figured it was some old hunting lodge or maybe a trapper's cabin from decades ago. I bet this place is haunted, Emma joked, trying to lighten the mood. Jason smirked but said nothing. As we stepped closer, we noticed something odd. The air felt different, heavy, stale. It was as if the forest around the cabin was holding its breath. And then there were the carvings. Strange symbols etched into the doorframe and walls, circles, lines, and crude figures that looked almost human but not quite. Maybe we shouldn't go in, I suggested, feeling my stomach churn. Jason rolled his eyes. Come on, it's just an old shack. What's the worst that could happen? Against my better judgment, we went inside. The interior was worse than the outside, dark, damp, and suffused with the smell of rotting wood. The floor was littered with leaves, dirt, and animal bones. A table in the corner held a single, rusted lantern and a small pile of faded photographs. They were black and white, showing a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were eerily blurred, as if the photos had been damaged by water or time. That's creepy, Emma muttered, picking one up. Let's just keep moving, I said, suddenly desperate to leave. But Jason, ever the skeptic, wanted to explore further. That's when we heard it, a faint sound coming from somewhere deeper in the cabin. It was like a whisper, too quiet to make out the words, but unmistakably there. Did you hear that? Emma asked, her voice trembling. Probably just the wind, Jason replied, though he didn't sound convinced. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from the cabin itself, but seemed to echo from the woods outside. Emma froze. We should leave. Now. For once, Jason didn't argue. We hurried out, but the forest didn't feel the same. The cheerful birdsong was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. The trail, which had seemed so clear before, now felt unfamiliar. How far did we hike in? I asked, trying to mask my rising panic. Not far enough to get lost, Jason said, pulling out his phone to check the GPS. No signal. We pressed on, following what we thought was the trail. The whispering didn't stop. It seemed to follow us, circling, moving, always just out of sight. At first, we thought it was our imaginations, but then Emma screamed. She pointed to a tree ahead of us. Carved into its bark was one of the symbols from the cabin, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward. We hadn't seen it before. That wasn't here earlier, Jason said, his voice cracking. We started walking faster, not bothering to hide our fear anymore. Every few minutes, we'd spot another carving on a tree, as if something or someone was leading us deeper into the forest. The whispering grew louder, closer. It no longer sounded like words, but more like a low, guttural growl. And then we saw it. Ahead on the trail, standing motionless in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, thin, and draped in what looked like tattered black fabric. Its head was obscured, but its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides. For a moment, none of us could move. It didn't feel real, like we were looking at a twisted mirage. Then it moved, not towards us, but around us, vanishing into the trees with an unnatural speed. Jason swore under his breath, and we all broke into a run. I don't know how long we ran, but it felt like hours. The forest seemed endless, the trail looping back on itself. The sun began to set, and with the darkness came an even deeper terror. We stumbled into another clearing, gasping for air. To our horror, it was the same clearing with the cabin, but something was different. The door, which had been open earlier, was now shut, and the symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. Emma began to cry. Jason tried to comfort her, but his own fear was palpable. We'll just camp here until morning, he said, though none of us believed it was a good idea. Night fell quickly, and with it came the sounds. Footsteps in the underbrush, the whispering now unmistakably close, and that growl, deep and guttural, echoing from the darkness. We huddled together near the cabin, too scared to go inside, but too terrified to stay out in the open. Every so often, we'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees, shadows darting between the trunks, eyes glinting in the darkness. Around midnight, Jason decided he'd had enough. I'm going back to the trailhead, he announced, his voice trembling. Are you insane? I whispered harshly. You can't see anything out there. I'd rather take my chances, he said. Before we could stop him, he was gone, swallowed by the forest. We waited for hours, listening for any sign of him. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voice, only the relentless whispering and the occasional growl. By dawn, we decided to make our own attempt at escape. But the moment we stepped away from the cabin, we found Jason, or what was left of him. His body was twisted, broken, lying face down in the dirt. His hands were clawed as if he'd been trying to drag himself back, and carved into the tree above him was another symbol, a circle with a jagged horizontal line running through it. We ran. I don't remember much of that part, just the sheer animalistic terror driving us forward. Somehow, we made it back to the trailhead. But the forest wasn't done with us. As we reached the car, I glanced back one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees was the figure. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at us as if to say, "This isn't over." We drove away, leaving the forest behind, but the whispers, they never left.